Okay, so in the previous clip we have prepared our raw file for further development in raw editor. We have performed the quick cleanup, and now in this clip let's evaluate our image in terms of noise. So basically, the best strategy when dealing with noise is to avoid creating noise in the first place. The most important factor, the most important thing that you should remember is to simply shoot with the lowest ISO as possible. So if you have a look at this image, first of all, let's enlarge the image. Now we are looking at the photo at 30%, so let's just make it larger. Let's look at it at least at 100% magnification. So now I have 174, and if I look closer at the image, I must say I'm very happy with the state of affairs. There is no excessive noise. These hills were positioned really far away from me. The lighting conditions were very good, so I didn't have to push my ISO to high value to be able to take this shot. In fact, if you look at the right hand side panel, you can see that this image was taken with the ISO set at 200. So this image is a very good example of this principle in action. Simply shoot with the lowest ISO possible. So what are other steps we could take to avoid excessive noise in our image? Very important thing is to avoid underexposure. Ideally, the histogram should be exposed to the right hand side. When it comes to this particular photo, I haven't exposed this image to the right. As you can see, the largest peak of information is positioned to the left-hand side of our graph. So if you are shooting in difficult lighting conditions and you have to push your ISO settings higher, if you are simply forced to set the ISO at higher value, for example above 1000 or 2000, it depends as well on the camera. The more sophisticated camera you have, the better it will deal with the noise. So if you have to use high ISO settings, try to expose to the right. The expression simply relates to the shape of the histogram. As you can see here, I have the largest peak of information near to the left-hand side of the histogram, and it indicates the shadows, quite rich shadows in my image. The ideal shape of the histogram, if you are thinking in terms of avoiding noise, is to expose your image to the right, so you would have much wider range of highlights and bright midtones, and the shadows for sure cannot be clipped. And the third step that you can take in order to avoid excessive noise in your images is to avoid adding noise in post-production. We will talk about it when we will look at two more examples. Since in case of this image there is no issue with extensive noise, let me just jump into next image and we will talk about the noise in further detail. Okay, so this is our next example, and before we dive deep into analyzing this image in terms of noise, I would like to mention that there are basically two types of noise. You can have in your images either luminance noise or you can say grayscale noise. And when you encounter this kind of noise, you will see that only the brightness of a color pixels is affected. All the pixels will be within the same color, within the same shade, and this will be luminance noise. We will illustrate it very soon. And the second type of noise you can have in your images is a color noise or chrominance noise. In case of the second noise, you will have the gritty look, but you will have as well spectacles, you will have pixels with different random colors. So you can have multicolored speckles, you can have pink, greenish pixels in your images. So remember, when you are dealing with noise, you can have either luminance noise or color noise. Let's now jump back to our image. Let's focus in our image. As you remember, to evaluate any photograph in terms of noise, we should magnify at least to 100%. So I've just performed basic corrections on this image. I have corrected exposure slightly and I have added a little bit of clarity. So after performing the exposure correction, as you can see now, the image was taken during the night with quite difficult lighting conditions. I didn't have any supporting lights. I was just shooting with the Fujifilm camera and the wide angle lens. And in case of this image, the main subject was this beautiful building, the Garden of Dreams in Kathmandu, Nepal. So in order to capture the architectural detail in this building, I was forced to push my ISO settings to 3200, which is not extremely high, but it was high enough to cause extensive noise in my image. So how do we approach the noise problem? Now we are in the basic panel in the Adobe Camera Raw. Let's move over to the detail panel where we can deal with noise issue. I want you to take notice that in the detail panel we have sharpening and noise reduction positioned one beside another. There is a reason for that, and I want you to notice as well that by default automatically Adobe Camera Raw already is applying sharpening and noise reduction to your images. So as you can see, the sharpening is already applied at 25. You have the radius detail set automatically by Adobe Camera Raw. The Luminance Noise reduction is not active, however Adobe Camera Raw is correcting your color noise. As you can see, the values here are set at 25, 50 and 50. So I just want you to be aware of these settings, of these automatic corrections. So now, what is the reason why the sharpening and noise reduction are positioned beside each other in the detail panel? So in short, noise reduction will blur your image and you can try to balance this with either local or global sharpening. Okay, so let's move back to our photograph. Let's zoom in a little bit more, and as you can see, after performing the very basic exposure correction, I have the noise visible here. So let's try to get rid of the luminance noise. If I zoom in, you can see that we are dealing here with luminance noise. There are no pixels in random colors. The main issue is the gritty texture and degradation of the quality of the image. So let's try to address this issue with manipulating with the luminance noise reduction slider. If I start pushing this slider towards the right hand side, notice that I have activated these two sliders positioned underneath luminance detail and luminance contrast. So if I start pushing my slider further, we can see that the noise that was present within the sky is getting softer. We can have a quick preview by toggling this icon on and off. So this is the original image and this is the image after applying this noise reduction. So we could be quite happy with our new sky. However, if we have a look at the detail, if we have a look at the rest of our image, basically it looks horrible. It is blurred, it looks plasticky, and we have lost all the detail that was present here before. You can now try to solve this problem with sharpening. So you can here manipulate with the amount, that way you will add sharpness to your image. You can manipulate a bit with the radius, however these two sliders in particular, radius and detail, are quite unpredictable, so I wouldn't really spend ages trying to set them perfectly. I would focus my attention on the last slider. The masking slider in Adobe Camera Raw in the detail panel is really fantastic feature, and it allows you great control over sharpening. So how does it work? If you press and hold Alt key on your keyboard and if you start manipulating with the slider, you can see that your image is turning temporarily into black and white. So the initial state when we had the value 0, at this point we had our image entirely white, which indicates that sharpening was applied to the overall image. However, by moving the slider, we can mask away certain parts in our image, and as you can see, the further I push the slider towards the right hand side, the more dark areas I have, and the dark areas indicate masking. So those areas in the image that are black now are not going to be sharpened. So that way I can precisely apply masking to only selected areas. So this is really very handy feature. By masking, we can take this adjustment from global to local. So if I zoom out a little bit now, and if I toggle my icon on and off, we can see the original image, and now we can have a look at the image after performing the adjustments. So for the sake of this course, I'm working really quickly. I want to illustrate you the idea, and I want you to get familiar with these features, since remember that if you are really heavy-handed while manipulating with noise reduction, you will inevitably run in troubles. So always combine noise reduction with sharpening, and always make use of the masking slider, as it can be really helpful and it can save you a lot of hassle. A very important point to remember is that the amount of noise reduction needed when you are performing your edit depends entirely on final output. So now we are dealing with a high-res image, and my intention is to prepare this image, let's say, for print. However, if you would like to have this image printed as the final size as a postcard, there is absolutely no need to perform these noise corrections, since no noise would be visible at such a small size. Let's now jump to the third image, and I would like to show you an example of color noise. Okay, so our third example has been loaded. Let's just zoom in. And as you can see, the photo was taken with really high ISO value. I have the number here, it's 4500. So no wonder we have quite a big amount of noise here. Let's just move over to the detail panel, and I just want to disable color noise. So if I move these sliders towards 0, you can clearly see what I meant by referring to color noise. In the previous picture, we were dealing with the issue of extensive noise as well. However, all these little speckles were at the same color. Here we clearly see that we have all these speckles at random colors. If I really zoom very closely, now I am at over 400%. We can clearly see the red, yellow, bluish pixels. So this is color noise. You can say as well Chrominance noise. And very handy option is that Adobe Camera Raw is trying to automatically get rid of the color noise, and it did the job quite well. So I can't remember what was the default setting. However, if I set the color noise reduction at about 19, it is quite sufficient. Now I have only luminance noise to deal with, and I can proceed from here exactly the same steps as with the previous picture. So first I would apply the luminance noise correction, and then I have to evaluate the image if I have lost detail, if I have softened the texture extensively, and further I would balance between the sharpening and noise reduction adjustments. And one last thing I would like to mention when we are talking about noise reduction is how we can avoid adding more noise during post-processing. Let's quickly jump to our basic panel, and I want to indicate two sliders that are basically noise generators. So the first one is the clarity slider. Clarity simply adds contrast within the midtones range. In this case, in case of this portrait, it's not really very visible, the changes. However, we can see that the background and the face of the model is getting a little bit more harsh. We are adding a little bit more texture. So if we push clarity to the extreme, you can see that the texture got much stronger. If I disable this icon and enable it again, you can see that without even touching the exposure slider, without correcting exposure for this image, we have increased the contrast within the midtones range, and at the same time we have increased the issue of noise in this photograph. So this is the noise I have added by manipulating with clarity. If I toggle this icon off, this is before I touch the clarity slider. So bear in mind, when you are manipulating with clarity, it will add noise to your images. So the second slider that is a great noise generator is the shadow slider, and if I would like to reveal a little bit more detail in the shadow, if I start pushing this slider towards the right hand side, I'm making the shadows brighter, however I'm adding noise to the image as well. So let's just toggle this icon on and off, so that's after and that's before. So bear in mind that the best practice is to keep your ISO as low as possible when you are taking the photograph, and then during the post-processing try not to be heavy-handed with either those manipulations with shadows, clarity and exposure, and when you are in your detail panel, try to use masking slider, as it is really efficient feature and can help you save some of your images that are suffering from extensive noise. Okay, so in this clip we have discussed noise correction. Let's move over to the next video and let's continue working on developing our raw file. See you in the next clip.